Why do schools always seem to be at the center of political fights? Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Professor Jonathan Zimmerman, a historian of education at the University of Pennsylvania, whose work explores how schools have been shaped by larger cultural, political, and ideological conflicts in American history. Debates over what should be taught in schools aren't new. In fact, schools have been battlegrounds for bigger questions about morality, identity, and the direction of American society since this nation's birth. In today's conversation, we'll explore why education has become so politically contested, how different groups try to shape schools over time, and what this history reveals about the divisions we see today. Professor Zimmerman, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
To start, what inspired you to begin studying education history, and when did you realize that schools were really a look into broader conflicts about American history?
Well, what inspired me to study it was that I had been a school teacher before I was a historian. I was a teacher first in Nepal, where I was in the Peace Corps, and then I was a public school teacher in Vermont and Maryland. And it was my Nepal experience that actually started getting me interested in education and the way that it was inflected by culture. So I was in a part of Nepal where it was a 3-day walk from vehicular traffic. Most people had never encountered somebody that wasn't Nepali, and they had entirely different understandings of what education was. The way English was taught, and English is a mandatory subject, it is in many parts of the world. This is how it was taught. Yo kukur ho, this is a dog. Yo kukur ho, this is a dog. Yo biralo ho, this is a cat. Yo biralo ho, this is a cat. Leading kids in a chant. That wasn't the way I learned, and it wasn't the way I taught. I made a blackboard by putting charcoal on a piece of wood, and I wrote on it with a rock, and I drew a picture of a dog. And I said, "What's that?" And everyone said kukur, right? They said the Nepali word they could recognize. And I said, "No, that is a dog." And I just say, "That is a dog. Say that is a dog." And then I would say to a kid, "Ask her. Say, what is that?" And the kid would say, "What is that?" And I would say, "Answer. That is a dog." Um, uh, and so, I started to realize that everything we believed about education was bound by our own history and culture. Uh, what made sense to them educationally made no sense to me educationally, and that's because we grew up in different places and times. So that's really what got me interested in the subject.
And today, when students debate schools in general, it feels super new and intense to us now, especially in the light of recent motions to hang up the Ten Commandments in schools. From your perspective, how much of this is actually new and how much is something that we've seen repeatedly throughout not just American history, but history in general?
Well, the theme of contestation over schools we see throughout, and here's why. Schools make nations. So, Jai, when nation states developed, one of the first things they did was create school systems. The United States is no different, right? I mean, obviously there were schools in colonial America, but they became much more populated and they had a different purpose once we made a nation. And the purpose was indeed to make a nation, right? To make people believe that they were part of a country, that they shared a history, and that they shared a future. Here's the thing. The same citizens of the nation that the schools create do not agree about what the nation is or should be. They never have. And in democracy, they never will. So, what that means is even though schools make a nation, they're also a site of contestation precisely because we disagree about what the nation is or should be. So, they will always be sites of controversy precisely because they make citizens and because the citizens disagree with each other about what the school should be.
So in the public sphere, there's so many places for these battlegrounds to play out, and as you're saying, schools build nations, and they become an area for people to contest ideas about morality, religion, and American identity. Why do you think education specifically becomes the place where most of these conflicts play out?
Well, because schools are our primary public venue for creating citizens. So look, Jai, lots of things make citizens. TV and the internet make citizens, and sports make citizens, right? But most of those other institutions are private institutions, right?
Yeah.
Schools are a central public institution for making citizens, and so they're also the central place where we decide who we are and what we want to be.
And it's a general idea that people are talking about school reform, and I think a general misconception is that everyone assumes that we're working towards the same goal. But what did reform actually mean to different groups, and how do those visions often conflict with each other?
Well, look, uh, reform too is always going to be contested because we disagree about the purpose of school. So, sh one thing school does is create citizens. Another thing it does is create workers. Another thing it does is uh, it provides daycare and childcare services. In this country, it feeds kids, like millions of kids every day. Um, Schools teach lots of different things and they have lots of different purposes. Um, and so, to your point, if we're reforming schools, we must have an end in sight. But those ends are themselves contested. Even the idea of what a child is or what a child should be, we have different understandings of childhood. One of the books I wrote was about sex education, and it turns on this like there are fundamental disagreements in our country and other countries about, is a child a sexual creature? Sigmund Freud thought so. He thought that we were sexual from birth, indeed from utero, and that society made us neurotic by trying to deny those impulses. But not everyone sees the world that way. And sex, especially, is deeply inflected by faith and culture. And again, your assumptions about what kids are, and we're going to disagree about those too.
So, in your opinion, do you think in a democratic nation it's impossible to reach a consensus on what conform really is?
If consensus means full agreement, it is impossible. But you know where they have full agreement? Authoritarian countries. It's not that everybody agrees, but somebody at the top imposes what the quote agreement is going to be on everybody else,
That's true.
right?
Yeah.
When Saddam Hussein was still in power in Iraq, he got 99% of the vote. And woe to that 1%, right? Because they probably didn't live very long. I think sometimes we have unrealistic expectations and we fetishize a kind of consent. And in fact, I think we should be grateful that we have the right to disagree, and that we have the right to raise our voices and to try to influence what schools do and what schools should be, even though we know that there will never be full agreement about it.
And on a more historical note, your work highlights a lot about conservative activism in education, which I don't think many students learn about too much. What do you think people misunderstand about these efforts to shape schools?
Well, first of all, that they're long-standing, right? I mean, one of the biggest political battles in the 1920s was the Scopes trial, which had to do with whether we should teach evolution in schools. So we've been arguing about these things for a long time. But, Jai, I think the most important thing people forget is that these, quote, political pressures have come from every side of the political spectrum. And for people whose view is, well, Moms for Liberty should just butt out these terrible right-wing people trying to impose their view on us. And why should these parents have any say in what we do? Well, they should look at the history, for example, of history instruction, which is something I've written about. Jai, when I was born in 1961, many history textbooks in the United States depicted slavery as a mostly beneficent institution developed by well-meaning Christian white people to civilize savage Africans. Now, that's not what your textbook says. Why not? You know why not? Here's why. The NAACP and the Urban League made committees, quote, textbook committees of parents and citizens who converged on school boards and schools and said, no, you're not teaching that to my kid. So if your premise is, the parent should just butt out of this, well, do you think the NAACP and the Urban League should have butted out? I don't. I'm in fact very glad that they butted in.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Scopes trial earlier, and I think that's a very fundamental turning point in the way that a lot of Americans saw education at the time. When you look at the Scopes trial, do you see it more as a battle between Christians and non-Christians in the matter of evolution, or an urban versus rural kind of debate about what should be taught?
Actually, it was all of those, but either but not entirely or correctly. So Christian against people who aren't Christian, that doesn't work because there were plenty of liberal Christians in the United States, and Catholics, by the way, who thought it was perfectly fine to teach evolution, and that was perfectly consistent with their view of Christianity. With respect to urban rural, a little bit more. It's clear that there were that on the countryside there was a lot more anti-evolutionist sentiment, but that's also a little bit distortive because one of the most prominent anti-evolutionists lived in Minneapolis. So there were plenty of anti-evolutionist movements in cities. So the urban-rural thing doesn't exactly work. I think the more convenient, or perhaps the more illuminating way to describe it is disagreements over American culture and over what modernity meant. So the 1920s is a time of enormous cultural shift. You have more women going to college. This comes on the heels of the suffragist movement and kind of a nascent feminist movement. Um, you have the silver screen in Hollywood showing men and women kissing and doing all kinds of other terrible things. You have prohibition over alcohol. And all of these things are really cultural battles, again, over who we want to be, what modern America should mean. And I think the evolution debate becomes a kind of basket for all those different anxieties. It becomes a symbolic battle over modernity itself. Do we like the direction America's going? If you do, you support evolution instruction. And if you don't, you oppose it.
It's interesting. And we talked about the NAACP with the textbooks. When we look at other current debates in education, whether it's curriculum or what teachers can and can't say, do you see other parallels to earlier moments in American or even outside of American history? And if so, how have those situations played out?
Well, look, there have always been constraints on what teachers can say and do. And obviously, some of those constraints are legitimate, right? I mean, there are constraints on every profession. A lawyer can't divulge to the other side the strategy of her client. A psychologist can't get on a crowded bus and start talking about the dark secrets of her, of her patient,
Yeah.
right? So there are all professions have constraints on them, but I would argue that the constraints on teachers have been excessive and also counter-educational. And what I mean by this is I think that because teachers have low status in this society, they've often been constrained from talking about any of these issues that we're discussing right now,
Yeah.
um, because there's so much fear of opposition from one side or another. Um, and so, our schools are supposed to make democratic citizens. But I think the constraints on teachers make it very hard for the schools to do that because the teachers are afraid to introduce the subjects that divide us. And I think that's been especially so in the past 20 years.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I'm sure many people listening to this could probably agree with that as well. That much of the stuff that we think are core values of being American in many schools across the country aren't really touched on in as much depth as they should be, and those are the issues that, as you're saying, make democratic citizens.
Right, but Jai, I would add that obviously there is incredible variation across the country.
Of course, yeah.
And there's obviously political variation and polarization. And if I were king, and we don't have enough time to this morning to enumerate all the reasons that will not happen, but if you went to school at Scarsdale High School like you do, you would be paired with a sister school in northern Alabama, and you would Zoom with that school every week in a structured way. The teachers would set it up. And one week you would talk about abortion rights. The other week you would talk about the war in Iran. Another week you would talk about guns and gun regulation. Um, and you would learn how to speak across differences. You know, you and I, Jai, we live in democratic bubbles. You know what I'm talking about,
Of course,
right?
yeah.
And I'm sure there's some Trump voting students or families at your school, but they're mostly in the closet,
Yeah.
you know. and they're afraid of people like you. And so I think if we really want to train democratic citizens, that we should all get out of our bubbles. But where is the democratic impulse for that? When I wrote that idea as a column, it set a record. Nobody liked it. Exactly nobody in America. The people in Northern Alabama said, why would I want to talk to those like libtard gay trans people in New York? And the
Yeah,
people in New York said, like, why would I want to talk to those like fat evangelical Christian racists in Alabama? And of course, I thought that proved my point because that's what columnists always think,
yeah,
right? But until we get people like you talking to people in other parts of the country with different understandings of what America is, we're not going to get very far as a nation.
I think that's a very valuable perspective and way to go about things, especially just looking at
Well,
my
well, people like you and me have to raise our voices in favor of that. And as a student of mine once said, there's no interest group called People for Debating the Other Side in Schools,
that's a
right?
that's a very good point.
I think there are people like you and me who want this, but we're not an interest group. And I don't think we've raised our voice enough. We haven't made a strong enough democratic case for what I'm calling democratic education, right? That sort of experiment that I just described, like, if enough people wanted it, it would happen.
Yeah,
We haven't persuaded enough people that that would be valuable.
yeah,
I've been trying to make this case for a long time and I have failed. I have not made a strong enough democratic case for democratic education. Um, I think we get the schools that we want and that we deserve. And I don't think there are enough people that actually want the kind of dialogue that I'm asking for. If they did, we'd have it. And they don't
yeah,
trust teachers to lead kids in it. That's the other really important thing. We live in a country where teachers have very low status, especially compared to other democracies. And that's a really important part of this whole story, right? People that have low status, right? Their jobs are much more tenuous. They don't have as much freedom. Um, to really engage in these dialogues, we need teachers not just that are very well educated themselves, but teachers who have the freedom and the authority to engage in that discussion. And in many parts of America, they don't.
yeah. And I think especially when we look at political and cultural divides in America, do you think that people underestimate how much just looking at schools could be a broader reflection of those divides in general?
Yes, yes, those divides, and also a broader reflection of, let's just call it the bipartisan will to censor. So I'll give you an example. Do the English teachers at Scarsdale High School teach the adventures of Huckleberry Finn?
No.
Okay, so here's my point. You've no doubt read about this last wave of book banning involving Moms for Liberty and all of
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
If you're the sort of American like me, the sort of liberal American who's outraged by, Loudoun County, Virginia getting rid of Toni Morrison's Beloved, or
Yeah.
Murfreesboro, Tennessee getting rid of Art Spiegelman's Mouse, if you're outraged by that, like I am, where were you when Scarsdale High School was dropping the adventures of Huckleberry Finn? Where the F were you? And you know why they dropped Huck Finn? It's not because of Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis, all right, or Moms for Liberty. Okay, that came from the left side of the political spectrum. They dropped Huck Finn because people on the left, not people on the right, objected to the fact that Huck Finn uses the N-word 200 times. But here's the larger point, Jai. They didn't trust teachers to address that issue. All acts of educational censorship reflect a lack of trust in teachers. Is that a delicate matter? The N word in Mark Twain? Yeah, delicate and complicated, for sure, right? And the words we use to describe race and the words we use to express racism, difficult and complicated. And because we didn't trust teachers to lead us through those difficulties and complications, we got rid of Huck Finn. But the we in that statement are people on the left, not
Yeah.
people on the right.
So where do you think this lack of trust in teachers stems from, and how do you think it's evolved over the course of American history?
Well, I mean, the lack of status in teachers stems from the 19th century and the birth of the American common schools. And here's the very short story. By 1850, America educated a bigger swath of its own, of its people, its young people, than any nation on earth.
Yeah,
It was mostly at the primary level. It was almost entirely white people, but it was boys and girls. And by 1850, we educated a bigger fraction of our kids than any nation state in human history up until that time, which I think most Americans justly see as a triumph. I do.
yeah,
But here's the problem, and this is where it relates to the status of teachers. If what you want to do is quite suddenly educate lots of people that have never gone to school before, by definition, by necessity, you're going to have to hire teachers who have barely more formal education than the kids in their charge, right? What are the other options? You can't just snap your fingers and get an educated teaching force, right?
yeah,
If suddenly you're bringing schools to places where they had never existed, the people who become teachers aren't going to have very much education. How could they? Right? And you're going to need millions of them eventually, right? So who did we pick to become our teachers? Young women between the ages of 16 and 21. They were available pre-marriage, right? That was the pattern. You went in the one-room schoolhouses in rural America. A big swath of the teachers are like 18, 19-year-old. Today we might say girls. Back then they said women,
yeah,
because they were available, and they would teach for a couple of years before they got married, and then you would bring in another group of very young women. Um, uh, Not a great formula for making a respected profession, is it?
yeah.
Right? But it made sense, right? You needed somebody there,
I mean,
right?
with that many kids to teach,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. And also, this was tied up in notions of gender. Remember, it was a schoolhouse. It wasn't a school, right? It was a schoolhouse. And Jai, that house was like a little mini family.
yeah,
And who was in charge? Mom, right? And this echoes the evolving middle class American family, right? Where dad goes out into the workforce and he goes to work in factories and other places that produce things. And the family gets reconfigured as a place where mom is in charge. And what does the family make? It makes kids. It
hmm,
makes people. And so the teacher was often called the school marm. Get it? Right? She was a mother figure, or a mother in waiting, a mother in making.
yeah,
Um, and so it's precisely the near universality of education in America, which is a great triumph, that comes around to bite us in the rear end in a way, because it's precisely that accounts for the low status of teachers in this country. In nations that restrict education to a smaller number of people, lo and behold, we find that the teachers had higher status, of course, right?
yeah.
So that's where it begins.
So, in much of the 1940s and 1950s, we see the whole idea from Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal, kind of playing out, even though it's not, it's separate but not equal. And in a lot of the southern states, you have kind of what you're saying, young black women are the people teaching these schools. But because of Brown v. Board of Ed, a lot of these southern schools ended up shutting down, and I guess across a long period of time integration happened. Would you think that's the switch when education became more, I'm not sure what the right word would be, but when teachers should have deserved that higher status, but it still became a kind of low status profession?
Well, I mean, now we're moving into a different era and a different set of issues. And I should
Yeah,
tell you, John, I'm gonna have to go shortly. I'm going half hour, like Ed, for the
got it.
whole
Yeah,
day. Um, but the story of Brown, again, we regard justly as a triumph. It's a unanimous statement on the part of the Supreme Court that state-sponsored apartheid is unconstitutional, right? There's a reason that on May 17th we celebrate this decision, and I think we should.
yeah,
But just like universal primary education for white people had some, let's just say, unintended and negative outcomes for teaching and for education, so did Brown.
Mhm.
And one of them is the shuttering of some all-black schools that were highly effective. Now, let's be very clear, and we could spend the whole day talking about this. Not all of them were effective. There were black kids in the Jim Crow South who went to school in tar paper shacks.
Yeah.
One of the people that wrote about this, interestingly, was Jackie Robinson, the baseball hero. He became a journalist after his career was over, and he wrote about kids who go to black kids who went to school in tar paper shacks. But you know what? Some of the schools were like because blacks taxed themselves and raised their own money because the schools, the state was giving them so little. Um, some of the schools were highly effective. And what happened after Brown v. Board of Ed is they were closed and a lot of their teachers were fired.
Mm.
And so, there are books with titles like Jim Crow's Pink Slip that describe this process. Um, and so, the people that advocated for Brown, I don't think most of them actually wanted African American teachers to be fired. But that's what happened. And that also represented, I think, a huge, huge loss for the teaching profession. um, because some of those teachers, again, were highly effective. Um, they were actually very high status figures in their communities, precisely because in many of their communities, people didn't have any formal education.
Yeah.
But the teachers did, and they were central figures in those communities, and a lot of them were either demoted or fired after Brown. Now, is that an argument against Brown v. Board of Education? Of course it isn't, right? Like I said, Brown v. Board of Ed is justly regarded as a triumph, but it's a reminder of just how complicated these questions are, especially in terms of their consequences and their consequences for teachers.
Great. Thank you so much.